Back in the 90s, the original Scream trilogy was one of my favourite series of movies. At the time, I hadn't seen any of the Halloween films that influenced it, but I really enjoyed the blend of self-aware humour, brutal killings, and shocking twist endings. Somehow I never got round to seeing the most recent instalments, but to celebrate Halloween, I thought it would be a good idea to watch all 6. Do the originals still hold up, and can the new ones possibly be anywhere near as good? I was surprised by what I thought of them, so maybe you will be too. If there's any of these movies you haven't seen, don't worry, I won't be revealing the identity of the killers in this video, but I will be talking about some of the victims.
So, do you like scary movies? There's just no peripheral vision in this. How do you manage to kill someone in this? It's just ridiculous.
First up, the original from 1996. The 12-minute opening scene with Drew Barrymore is still an absolute classic, expertly building up the tension through a series of phone calls that start off funny and flirty, but gradually get more and more sinister. The threat just keeps on mounting until she is finally stabbed right at the moment her parents come home. Drew Barrymore's performance really makes it work. Her character is instantly likeable, and her death is heartbreaking. There are no murders in the next 40 minutes, while all the characters are being set up, but Sidney Prescott, played by Neve Campbell, is attacked twice. She's the main character here, although she's a bit bland in this one. Just an ordinary girl with not much personality to her. She's a lot better in the future instalments. Her boyfriend Billy is the prime suspect, and Skeet Ulrich gives an incredibly creepy performance. The character is instantly hateable, pressuring his girlfriend for sex at every opportunity, so you spend the entire movie hoping that he'll get killed off himself. And Matthew Lillard as his friend Stu is just as annoying, laughing like a hyena at every opportunity. It is possible my opinions on them could be affected by hindsight, but I can't imagine anyone watching this for the first time finding their characters at all likeable. The whole second half of the movie takes place in one long house party, where Jamie Kennedy as film geek Randy gets to deliver his theory of the rules of horror movies, which is another iconic scene which has been copied many times since. And Rosa McGowan's character Tatum is sadly killed by a garage door. She's definitely one of the most likeable characters of this movie, so it's a definite shame she didn't make it to the sequels. This is also where we get the first scenes between Gail Weathers, played by Courtney Cox, and Deputy Dewey, played by David Arquette. They have a really sweet relationship. She's a hard-nosed reporter, he's a naive sheriff's deputy, and it's not hard to see why they kept on bringing back those characters in subsequent movies. The final confrontation is another excellent scene. The first time I saw it, the killer's identity took me completely by surprise, though on subsequent viewings it has become rather obvious in hindsight. And the way Sidney turns the tables on her tormentor by using his own methods against him makes for a very satisfying ending. Obviously, the movie has lost a lot of its initial impact for me after seeing it multiple times, not to mention all of the sequels and parodies. But it's still a strong movie, full of references to horror films of the past, but with enough new shocks and surprises to stand as its own worthy contribution to the genre. I'll give it 8 out of 10. Scream 2 came out just 1 year later in 1997. This was the only film in the series that I actually watched in the cinema, so the opening scene worked on several different levels, using the premiere of the first Stab movie to comment on horror movie fandom, although I don't think anybody was wearing Scream masks in the cinema where I saw it.
I mean, it's not ideal to watch a movie through. You can barely see anything.
The cast this time is mainly drawn from 90s TV shows. There's Sarah Michelle Gellar from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Joshua Jackson from Dawson's Creek. Sid's new boyfriend is played by Jerry O'Connell from Sliders, who is much more likeable than Billy was last time, with a great scene where he serenades her in a crowded cafeteria. Timothy Olyphant from Deadwood plays his best friend. He looks surprisingly similar to Matthew Lillard in the first movie, but thankfully his performance is nowhere near as over the top. We also get Laurie Metcalf playing a very different role from Jackie in Roseanne, and she gets some strong scenes where she shows her acting range, as well as Lee Schreiber playing Cotton Weary, who was only in one scene in the first movie, where he gets wrongly accused. Here his character acts as a fairly obvious red herring, or is he? And he has a very complicated relationship with Sidney. Sarah Michelle Gellar's death scene is really the equivalent of Drew Barrymore's in the first movie. Again, it's just one girl in a big house, taunted by the killer before he finally gets to her. It's much more effective than the opening scene, which was mainly played for laughs, and reminds the viewer that this is still a horror movie. The regular characters are arguably much better here than they were in the original, now that they've had time to be established. Sydney is much more self-assured and capable, just trying to get on with her life and put the tragedy behind her. Randy is much more prominent here, as the nerdy best friend who secretly pines for her. His death is a real blow to the franchise, and the makers know it, as subsequent movies keep on bringing back similar characters to fulfill the same basic function. Gail is now a redhead, which is a definite improvement, and again her relationship with Dewey is a highlight. Although his reason for being in the movie is rather tenuous, as the character just shows up out of nowhere. There are noticeably more death scenes here than in the original, and the university setting makes it feel much more expansive than the small town of the original, with the big campus, various sorority houses and lecture theatres, all providing new environments for the killer to stalk their victims. Gail and Dewey being attacked in the soundproof recording studio is a definite highlight, as is the tense scene where Sydney and her roommate have to climb over the killer to get out of the car. The finale is again a very strong denouement. The theatre setting allows Sydney to use all kinds of theatrical effects to fend off her attacker, and there are two big reveals which were definite shocks the first time I saw it. Overall, it's bigger and better than the original, with more likeable characters and much more variation in the death scenes. It improves over the original in just about every way. I'll give it 8.5 out of 10. 3 years later, in the year 2000, we got Scream 3. This is by far the weakest of the original trilogy, for a variety of reasons, not least that it had a different writer to the first two. You can tell something is wrong right from the opening sequence, which is nowhere near the iconic scene in the first film or the multiple layers of the second. It's just a routine scene where Lee Schreiber's character and his girlfriend are killed off. But it does introduce the gimmick of the killer having a magical voice-changing machine that he uses to torment people over the phone. You can probably do that now with AI, but in 2000, not so much. The main setting is a film set in Hollywood, which gives them a chance to make lots of jokes about horror trilogies. But beyond the scene where one character hides in a room full of ghost-faced costumes and fake knives, it really doesn't do very much with the premise. And the new characters are all very forgettable cannon fodder, with the exception of Parker Posey, who is good value as hysterical actress Jennifer Jolie. Gail and Dewey are front and centre for most of the movie. Their characters have split up in the intervening time, but they are back together by the end of this one. Sydney is less present, but has a more interesting arc, living a solitary life at the start, but by the end of it she stopped living in fear and learned to start trusting people again. Although given the events of all three movies, it really should have had the opposite effect. She's haunted by the memory of her mother throughout, both in nightmares and in the discoveries she makes about her secret past in Hollywood, which could have been really interesting if they'd focused on it more, but it does jar with the more light-hearted tone of the rest of the movie. There is noticeably less gore than in the first two movies, as the studios wanted it toned down after the Columbine massacre, but instead of focusing on tension and suspense, they've made all the action scenes much more slapstick and broad than ever before, which is a real shame. Plus there's cameos from the likes of Jay and Silent Bob and Carrie Fisher, which further emphasise the comedic tone. The killer is perhaps the least memorable of the entire original trilogy. I must have seen this movie 3 or 4 times at least, but I still didn't remember who he was, which shows how little impression he made. Tying him into the events of the first two movies really doesn't work. He's made out to be the big mastermind behind the entire trilogy, but it just feels like an unnecessary retcon. By the end of the movie, Sydney, Gail and Dewey are all in a really good place, so it would have been an appropriate time to wrap up those character stories. Overall, it's by far the weakest of the series, with the emphasis on humour rather than horror, and none of the suspense or tension of the first two, and distinctly lacking in memorable characters or set pieces. I'll give it 4 out of 10. So maybe the series should have ended there. But 11 years later, we got another sequel, Scream 4. This starts with the most meta scene yet, a film within a film within a film, which lets them comment on how horror films and society have changed in the intervening 10 years, with characters talking about the Saw movies and introducing social media to the series for the first time. And it sets up the rest of the film nicely by being very clever but not very scary. After this, we find out what the regulars have been up to. Sydney is now a successful author, Dewey has become sheriff, and Gail is his wife, so they're all doing very well. We also meet another group of teens. Emma Roberts as Jill and Hayden Panettiere as Kirby are the definite standouts. The rest of them kind of fade into the background. although there is one character who somehow manages to live stream his entire life in 2011, so I don't know what the picture quality would have been like on that. There are about twice as many kills than the original, but it's definitely a case of quantity over quality. There's no time for any build-up or suspense anymore, it's just straight into the action. The only scene with any kind of suspense is when the killer says he's in the closet and Kirby slowly opens it, but none of the actual murders are at all memorable. To be fair, the ending is a strong one. The first time I saw it, the killer's identity came as a complete surprise. It makes for a great twist on the conventions of the genre, and their motivation for wanting to be famous feels very much ahead of its time. If they'd ended the movie there, it would have been a fantastic way to end the series. Unfortunately, the movie carries on for another 10-15 minutes with an extra hospital scene, kind of like if Halloween 2 was tacked on to the end of Halloween 1, which gives the film a much more conventional ending and takes everything back to the status quo. You can't help thinking it must have been added on at the last minute when the studios got nervous. If they just kept the original ending, the movie would have been so much better. Sydney doesn't have a massive amount to do here. The character arc feels over, and it would have made much more sense had this been her final appearance. It is good to see Dewey and Gale as a happy couple for once, rather than manufacturing any conflict between them. Andy has developed into a competent sheriff, while Gale has a decent storyline about reviving her journalistic career. Overall, it's decent enough, but falls short on many ways. 6 out of 10. After another 11-year break, in 2022 we got Scream 5, which was confusingly just called Scream Again. Not Scream Again, just Scream Again, if you see what I mean. It was intended as a back-to-basics project, and sure enough, the first scene goes back to the original format of one girl alone in a big house. Jenna Ortega is the first victim, so I already knew there was going to be a twist, as she's definitely in the sequel. As with Scream 4, we get to see how society has progressed since the previous movie, with the victim not answering the landline because nobody does anymore, and everyone referencing newer horror movies like Hereditary and The Babadook. But despite this film having new writers and directors, it very much matches the style of the originals, slowly building up the tension bit by bit until the killer reveals themselves. And Jenna Ortega as Tara is an excellent addition to the series. Most of the new characters are the children of the originals. They could easily have called it Scream the Next Generation instead. Again, most of them are just cannon fodder. The main characters are Tara, her sister Sam, played by Melissa Barrera, and her boyfriend, played by Jack Quaid. Sam is haunted by the ghost of her father, who is one of the killers from the original movie, and is terrified she will follow in his footsteps. It's an interesting twist, and the ghostly appearances of the dead character do a good job of making him look closer to how he did 25 years ago. But Melissa Barrera is still a bit bland and lacking in personality to have so much focus. Jack Quaid is good value throughout though. His character makes the most of his screen time and is very funny. The three surviving characters from the original movie are all back for the final time, although sadly we never see them all together. Gale and Dewey's happy ending has been reversed, and they've split up yet again, but Sydney now has a family with her boyfriend from Scream 3. I'm not entirely sure it was a good idea to bring them all back yet again. It might have worked better if they just concentrated on the new cast. I guess the fans wanted to see their old favourites back again, but considering what happens to one of them, they might have regretted it. There are noticeably fewer kills than there were in the last few movies. It's back to the style of the first few, with much more suspense and build-up. The scene where the character of Wes is alone in a house is a masterpiece of tension. He keeps opening and closing doors, and you keep expecting the killer to pop up behind him at any moment. There's also noticeably more gore than there was previously. For the first time, you see knives plunging through body parts and coming out the other side. So there's something for everybody. The climax takes place in a house, which is supposedly the same one from the original movie. I didn't recognise it personally, but there's been so many houses used in all of these movies, they all start to look the same. There's another fine surprise ending. One of the killers comes as a complete shock, but the other one I was spoiled for after reading interviews with them promoting their latest movie. But I guess this did come out 2 years ago, so it can't be helped. And once their true identities are revealed, the two killers do make a fine team, and they do a good job of matching the energy of the original killers. Overall, this is a fine return to form for the series, with a great cast and some memorable moments. I'll give it 8 out of 10. Just 1 year later, in 2023, Scream 6 was released. At the time, I got the impression that this was just another run-of-the-mill disappointing sequel, but it turns out it's actually one of the best of the series. For the first time, it's set in New York City, which gives it a whole different feeling to the rest of the series. The first scene has horror veteran Samara Weaving as the victim, as the killer lures her from a crowded restaurant into a dark alley, like a total idiot. But then there's an excellent twist as the killer takes his mask off, which has never happened before and instantly makes you think all bets are off. Obviously, the real killer then disposes of them, but it still grabs your attention. The 4 survivors from the previous movie are all back and all at college in New York City. Sam is in therapy after brutally killing the last murderer. This is something that's never really been dealt with before. The convention of the survivors killing the murderer at the end happens throughout this entire series, and this is the first time that the consequences of that are really explored. Melissa Barrera is much better here than she was last time. She's definitely got a handle on the character now. Jenna Ortega is also back. Her character has a lot more to do this time, as she was mainly in hospital in the last movie. Here she has a cute will they won't they relationship with the character of Chad. And Mindy steps up her role as the keeper of the franchise rules, with a great recurring gag about how she can never spot who the real killer is. All 4 definitely benefit from being familiar faces from the last movie, and they make for a very likeable little gang. We also get Hayden Panettiere back as Kirby, who is now an FBI agent. Her performance is definitely a high point. She's really improved with age, and she now has a nice, sly, acerbic wit. The only one of the original 3 to return is Gail, who feels like a leftover from another era, but she does get to have an extended face-off with the killer for the very first time. The set pieces are a lot more original than before, taking full advantage of the city setting. An early highlight is when the killer chases Sam and Tara into a convenience store and starts blasting them with a shotgun, which feels much scarier than usual, as it's an actual real-world setting, and you can easily imagine yourself in that same situation, at least if you live in America. Another highlight is when they escape from the killer using a ladder to crawl between buildings, and there's also the subway scene where half of the people in the carriage are wearing masks from horror films, Ghostface included, which is incredibly tense as you wait for one of them to inevitably be revealed as the killer. The finale is full of references to the franchise, set in a shrine full of artifacts from the previous murders, so it definitely helps to have watched them all in a short space of time, like I did. The killers' identities are again surprising. It carries on the trope of them being relatives of the previous killers, out for revenge, but it definitely builds on it and takes it to another level. Rather too many characters end up surviving when they should be dead from multiple stab wounds, but by now you've come to expect that from the series. You just have to accept that this is set in a parallel universe where you can survive multiple stab wounds and be walking around fine the next day. Overall, this is definitely one of the best of the series. Again, it takes what worked in the previous movie and does it better. So again, I'll give it 8.5 out of 10. So it turns out the 2 newest movies are just as good as the first 2. I was not expecting that. Of course, it could just be down to the novelty. These movies always are at best when you're watching them for the first time. So my enjoyment of them could well go down in subsequent viewings, who can say. But that's all the Scream movies so far. The next one was supposed to carry on Sam and Tara's story, but both actors dropped out for various reasons. I would have liked to see those characters again, but there's always a chance that the quality could have nosedived, like it did with Scream 3. Instead, the upcoming Scream 7 will go back to Cindy's story. I would rather they let her keep a happy ending, but who knows. The recent Halloween trilogy worked well, bringing back Jamie Lee Curtis's character with her daughter and granddaughter, so maybe they could do the same with Cindy Prescott. Anyway, that's all for now. Subscribe if you like my stuff. I might make this a regular feature, going through an entire series of horror movies every Halloween, and maybe I'll cover the occasional non-horror series throughout the rest of the year. So thank you for watching, and happy Halloween!